Okay. So thank you all for coming to our Manipulative, Mercenary, and Overbearing meeting about Jane Austen's Not So Nice Women. And I tried to really think of a title that didn't call them mean. So Not So Nice was what I settled on. But so we do have a bunch of discussion questions that I had kind of come up with before the meeting that people can use those. And if you need me to put them in the chat, I can put them in the chat. Kirk had a really good question that Kirk, if you want to say it out loud, or I can say it if I know you're in and out. Sounds like you might have a bad connection. But Kirk's question was to say one nice thing about the character if possible. Yeah, Kirk's on a bus. So if that's a good one for the chat, if people want to say, so any of the characters, if you can think of one nice thing to say about them, that might be fun. And I usually save the chat if I remember to do that, as well as the video, and usually send the link for that to the people who are in the meeting. We keep having people who drop out of the meeting and come back. So I think some people are not having good connections. And then Miriam had a really good question, and I think it's a great question to maybe start with. So Miriam, do you want to share your question?
Certainly. Thank you. My question is about Mary Crawford, and I am questioning whether she should really be in this group. She is mercenary to an extent, but she is basically, I think, a well-meaning, good-hearted person. And I have my my edition. I think this is volume, it's volume 1, chapter 15, I believe. It's when they've decided that they're going to perform lovers' vows. And Fanny has said that she could not act if you gave her the world. And Mrs. Norris, of course, makes that horrible remark about, consider, you should do it considering who and what she is. And then Mary Crawford stands up for her and moves close to Fanny. And she says to her in a kind, low whisper, "Never mind, my dear Miss Price, this is a cross evening. Everybody is cross and teasing, but do not let us mind them." And with pointed attention, continued to talk to her and endeavored to raise her spirits in spite of being out of spirits herself. By a look at her brother, she prevented any farther entreaty from the theatrical board, and the really good feelings by which she was almost purely governed were rapidly restoring her to all the little she had lost in Edmund's favor. And it's that phrase that I emphasize, the really good feelings by which she was almost purely governed. I'd also like to point out that she had to leave her uncle, the Admiral's house, after her aunt died. He introduced his mistress, which, and the fact that she would not condone such immorality and disrespect to her late aunt, I think shows those really good feelings. Henry won't open Everingham for her to live there. So I think some people villainize her, and I certainly think she's not had a lot of luck getting the men in her lives to listen to her. And I think one of the reasons she hasn't marry Edmund is because he wants her to change, but he doesn't seem at all interested in making any changes for her. I've probably said too much. It's a topic on which I probably cannot say enough, but I'll stop now. Thank you.
I just want to say that at our last meeting, which was about Fanny and Emma and why people don't like them, we spent a lot of time talking about Mary Crawford, and that was sort of the genesis of how this meeting came about. And I think it sort of connects with the question that I had in the question list about, whether you think Edmund marrying Fanny instead of Mary Crawford was a betrayal, which some of the critics will actually use that word betrayal. So I think it's a really interesting question because she is complex and she is a lot like Elizabeth Bennet. But my personal opinion is that she doesn't have that moral compass that Elizabeth does. So anyway, open the floor to anyone. Great question to start with.
I've always been a champion of Mary Crawford, so I agree with Miriam. I don't see anything really outlandish about her character as far as being mercenary or I just don't know. I'm not sure I get it. And of course, I've said this before in other meetings that I kind of like Mary Crawford. Is there something there that we just don't know about her that maybe Jane Austen is thinking of a character like Mary Crawford as she's introducing into a novel? I don't know, but I would think so.
I kind of feel like her following on Elizabeth, there was Pride and Prejudice with Elizabeth, and then there's Mansfield Park with Mary Crawford. I think that Jane Austen was sort of creating a problem for herself and seeing if she could kind of have this problem of someone who's got all these nice, good attributes and has this lack of moral compass, which again is my opinion, but that it's sort of it's harder to write Mary Crawford than it is to write Elizabeth Bennet, because Elizabeth Bennet everybody loves, but Mary Crawford is, I think, much more complicated.
I feel that there's a little selfishness in there because she just wants money, wants to marry wealth.
Yeah.
She's complicated. Because I don't think Jane Austen is setting out to be her, she's not purely evil or purely a villain. I think she is very selfish. And ultimately it's not necessarily that she doesn't deserve happiness, but she's not a good match for Edmund. And they both kind of know that they like each other, and so they're trying to see the version that they could live with in each other. They're each kind of blinded to assuming that the other will change to be the kind of person they could be with. And she is quite selfish and uses her wittiness to kind of be a blind for that, and kind of oh, there's no cure for, she uses jokes to get what she wants, and kind of she's very likable. And in some ways I like her. And it doesn't have to be a competition because to pick between Fanny or her being 100% in the right. But I guess, and in the end, she does kind of pick. I think in the end she's sort of divided between caring for other people and wanting the fine things in life that she's grown to expect and value. She has that sort of colder, cynical side to her, but it's not a completely that, which I find that more interesting as a character.
And yet people do change, as we see in all Jane Austen's novels. So Sarah, do you not think Mary Crawford would change if she was with Edmund after a time?
No, I don't. No, I think that would have been a lifelong battle. I think, people can change, but I don't think Mary does. Or not in that direction anyway.
Yeah, go ahead, Miriam. You don't have to raise your hand.
Sorry. Okay, I'm used to faculty meetings. I think there's another part, and I can't find it, but it's when Fanny is sure that Edmund and Mary will get married, and she's bemoaning poor Edmund, and Austen, is the narrator, remarks that if they were to get married, Mary would have been guided by Edmund. Her love and respect for him would have made her a lot more open, and would have made her change. And I think she does have a moral compass, but I don't think the compass is as wide as, well, certainly not as wide as Fanny's or as Elizabeth's. I mean, again, she's not going to stay in a house with her uncle's mistress. But she's, and I also think that she wants money because nothing in her life but money has, I can't think of the words, has, that she can't rely on she hasn't been able to rely on anything else but money. Her parents died when she was young. Her aunt has died. She can't, Henry loves her, but he's not going to, open Everingham so she can live there and keep house for him. So I think, and she's never met anybody like Edmund before. So I think even though she loves him, it's hard for her to believe that a love that sort of love would last forever. And perhaps she wants more money, even though she's got £20,000, because that's the only sure thing in her life.
I feel like with Fanny and with Mary and Edmund, she's sort of exploring the same dynamics that she did with Willoughby and Marianne of, here's this sort of passionate connection, passionate love, and, like, is there underneath that sort of companionate love that she thinks you need to have, that Austen thinks you need to have in the long run. And I do think that Mary lacked the capacity to kind of see things from Edmund's point of view. I don't think she ever tried to understand, why do you want to be a clergyman and what's that about? She never really tried to understand him. And I think that bodes horribly for a marriage. If you don't try to understand someone else's point of view. Anyway.
And you're right, but does he ever try to understand things from her point of view?
But yeah, I think that their connection is passion. I don't think that he necessarily tries with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. It's because they really are different people who want different things out of life. So I feel like they're incompatible, and not necessarily to say that it's 100% that he's all right about everything and she's wrong about everything, but they want different things, and they weren't in the long run actually going to be happy together, I don't think. Like he wants that, the quiet countryside, like his commitment to his duty and responsibility, which I don't think Mary, at least I don't think she's really turning in that direction, that she could have been happy with that.
We did ask, I think at the last meeting, can you imagine Mary as like a rector's wife or a parson's wife? No, I can't imagine her like, visiting the poor or doing anything like that.
Of course, Mrs. Elton is a parson's wife, and I don't think she does very much of it.
Oh no, she's awful.
And
She's on my list too.
She likes to consider herself benevolent, and so I think she would, in the wrong attitude, do the actions that she's supposed to do. Yeah.
I would throw in, just not that it's in the book, but just as a
from a 21st century perspective. I think that we forget, and when we're interpreting that part of the book, that evangelicalism hadn't really taken off, and that what we're used to today is that people who become ministers or priests do it as a calling. At that time, they hadn't defined it in those terms, that they did it because it was available. And I don't know if Edmund did it because he felt a calling, but I know I'm a minister's daughter. My parents are passed away now, but I remember my father always talking about when he was called to be a minister, and my mother felt a calling to be a minister's wife. And so I feel a strong bias to that story. And so when I read that part about Edmund and Mary, I'm just thinking, no, Mary, who doesn't even respect the role of a priest, would never be a proper wife, and you would need to have a proper wife to do that role. So it's sort of like an insult to even consider her as trying to even perform in that role, because we know it would never have happened. She wouldn't have been happy with it. It would never have come to term. It would never have happened. Anyway, that's just a 21st perspective on it, but I think it's is a value, because it's just sort of like, well, what did Edmund see in her? And it was only until she started to speak in a mercenary way regarding Edmund's brother possibly passing away and Edmund becoming the heir, that he really saw what her true nature was. So, I mean, to others' point who want to defend her, she still had that perspective, and I think that makes her different as a result. So I'm not a big fan of Mary myself, but we do know that Jane used her cousin, the French, Eliza, am I saying it correctly? Who ended up marrying her brother Henry? Is it Eliza?
Yeah.
Liza.
And is it Fouillide was her married name? But anyway, we do know that she used that relationship with that cousin as inspiration for Mary. So although the cousin was received, we do know that she had this different role or this different perspective. Even though she was a part of them, she still she was a little bit arm's length from everybody, I guess. There was a little, I'm going to say, mercenary aspect to her relationship with the family, although she visited and was a part and so forth. But anyway, I would just throw that in because I think we should remember that she served as an inspiration for Mary.
And yet Edmund's career choice of the church that's not necessarily because he saw a calling. It's more by default because his brother's going to inherit most of the estate, right? And it's been a little bit since I read Mansfield Park, but I was thinking that he briefly considered, another career besides the church. So that would certainly affect his attitude toward Mary Crawford, whether he would want her as a rector's wife or not.
Well, I think when they're at Southerton, I think very clearly articulates that there were other options for him as a second son, but he did pick being a clergyman because it felt like the best connection for him. And I don't think he used the word calling, but I think that he gives like sort of the best description of like, why someone would want to choose being a clergyman, and does talk about the importance of, being around the parishioners and not being an absentee clergyman. And so to me, it feels like he really did choose that, not just because he would get 600 or 700 pounds a year, but because it fit with who he is.
And it may very well be, he's one of those many people who like to help people, and that helping people, that if that was what his desire was, then being in the clergy gave him that opportunity to help people. So, you know, that may have been his motivation.
He also, if Tom hadn't gotten into debt so much, he would have had 2 parishes when he was of age to be ordained. He would have had Mansfield Parsonage, and as well as Thornton Lacey. Sir Thomas basically has to sell the living of Mansfield Parsonage to Dr. Grant to make up for, you know, to pay off Tom's debts. And so, you know, Edmund probably, you know, if he'd had those 2, and he does eventually get them at the end, he would have had almost 2,000 a year. So, and I think at one point Mary says, well, of course, when they're talking about the clergy, you know, afterwards in a later chapter, you know, Mary points out that Edmund, you know, that there's a family living available for him, and if that, and maybe that influenced him, and Edmund says that it did a little. But I mean, certainly he has a much more hands-on approach to being a pastor than, say, Dr. Grant. I don't think, I mean, Dr. Grant is not fitted for being a clergyman at all. I don't think. And Edmund certainly is.
So I just want to bring in the fun quotation from Virginia Woolf about Dr. Grant, that sometimes it seems as if her creatures were born merely to give Jane Austen the supreme delight of slicing their heads off. And she wrote that in the Common Reader in 1925, and it's specifically about Dr. Grant. But I think it applies to some of the women that she kills off also. Anyway, Dr. Grant is just so much fun because he's so just, yeah, such kind of like an awful clergyman.
And what I think is ironic is that at one point, and I don't want to take this conversation too far from the theme, but when Tom does not at all feel guilty about Edmund losing, you know, Mansfield Parsonage, and then when he sees Dr. Grant, he thinks that if Dr. Grant is just fed with enough good things, he'll pop off very soon. So I mean, you have Mary, you know, writing in a letter, you know, and who knows how serious she is, saying, oh well, gee, wouldn't it be convenient if Tom died? But then there's Tom, who originally thought about Dr. Grant. Oh, wouldn't it be convenient if Dr. Grant died? So I guess I don't know. And even comparing her, say, I think Mrs. Norris is worse than Mary Crawford.
Yes.
And I don't know how much better Mariah is than
She didn't
Mary
make the list
Crawford.
because she's just too minor a character.
Oh.
Minor, but blatantly selfish.
Yeah, it's kind of like I added Fanny Dashwood because Fanny Dashwood is so awful, but like her place and Sense and Sensibility isn't huge compared to like Lucy Steele. So I'm willing to you know, take arguments about who's on the list and who's not on the list.
I would say Fanny Dashwood's still on the list because she's a driver of how they ended up with no money. I mean, she's just so awful. So she kind of drives the plot a lot.
That's true.
Yeah, she was critical to driving that plot line. I agree, Roseanne.
And that chapter is so genius, like chapter 2, the first thing Jane Austen published. And there's like this killer chapter 2. Like, wow.
And we wonder if maybe Fanny was inspired by Jane's brother Edward's wife, Elizabeth, who didn't want Edward to help the mother and the daughters. So they had to go sofa surfing for years.
Yes.
Until she died with the 11th child. And then,
Yes.
only then did they get off for Chawton Cottage.
Fanny Dashwood. Yeah, not Fanny
Mhm.
Price.
Yeah, Fanny Dashwood.
Yeah, if you read between the lines of Jane Austen's letters, it seems pretty clear to me that Elizabeth didn't like Jane. And I also wondered if like Lady Middleton, who doesn't like Elizabeth, who doesn't like Eleanor and Marianne because they read and she thinks they're satirical. I kind of wondered if that comment was also connected with Edward's wife, Elizabeth.
Well, Lady Middleton and Fanny Dashwood do become wonderful friends since they're both so vapid and selfish.
And cold, can't forget cold.
Oh,
I have nothing against Lucy Steele. Because when I think about the Regency era, a young lady with no fortune, little to no fortune, I would suspect that, being mercenary would be very common. I mean, they had no choice if they wanted to be something other than a governess. Right. So and that's Lucy Steele was just protecting her means of marrying well. I mean, which is, I would argue that was common back in those days. So
I think you like the bad girls, is what I think.
Not particularly. Most of them I do not care for them all. Elizabeth Bennet is my favorite character of all Jane Austen characters. But I just don't, as I read all of Jane Austen's novels, and I think about what women had to go through back then, except for Emma, of course. But then you have Harriet, right? I mean, how miserable life would be from a young age up to adult age. What's their future like? This just kind of goes to, I think, your question 3 here. I made a comment in here is that, after a while, when these young ladies get up to adulthood, they've had a lot of practice at being mercenary. So it's not really, I just wouldn't say it's an insult against their character. I would say it's a need, a characteristic need.
I could forgive Lucy Steele a lot, but she deliberately deceived Eleanor after she had married Robert Ferrars. And there was no reason to do that. That was just nastiness. And so I can't forgive her for that. But on the other hand, I mean, she doesn't miss a trick. It's too bad Isabella Thorpe, couldn't have had her advice, because Isabella would have said, no, keep this fiance until you're legally married to the second fiance, and then tell him. I mean, I think you're right. I think that certainly Lucy has, a lot of reasons to act the way she did, but she was cruel to Eleanor.
Now, when you say cruel to Eleanor by marrying Robert and not telling Eleanor?
No, by cruel, I mean, well, first of all, she keeps bringing up her engagement to Eleanor when once would have been enough. And then when she marries Robert and she sees the Dashwood servant, Thomas, she acts like she has married Edward instead of Robert. And so Eleanor thinks that Edward has married Lucy and is heartbroken.
Or does she? She doesn't really.
I think it's intentional.
Yeah, I mean, you think it's intentional?
Very the way she says it.
But why would she need to say anything to the servant, for the Dashwood servants? I mean, Maybe
Well,
she felt guilty.
well,
I think she
She didn't even think
definitely
about it. She
tried
just-
to make Eleanor think that
It's petty.
she got
It's
married.
petty cruelty. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I agree that there's lots of reasons for like having some sympathy for Lucy Steele, her situation, and you can see, you know, but she is also on top of that, she is rather cruel and somewhat petty. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she, I think purposely was torturing Eleanor with, oh, look, I've got a letter from Edward, and oh, look how much the Dashwood family loves me, and, or Mrs. Ferris and the Dashwoods. Yeah, I think that she, like in her interactions with Eleanor, you can more clearly see just how amoral she is and just nasty.
Not desperate. Desperation.
It's
yeah, oh, I would agree.
but there's no reason that she has to torture Eleanor. She just does that for kicks.
Well, I think she's trying to convince Eleanor to forget about Edward.
Yeah, to move on. He's mine.
Yes. Yeah.
But Eleanor is so moral that she, you know, she was told once that he's engaged and that she no longer considered him as available at that point.
Yeah, but Lucy Steele doesn't know that. She's not
I
really.
think she does.
You think she's gauged Eleanor that early on?
I
And-
think by the time she tells Eleanor about the engagement, she knows that Eleanor is going to act honorably, because she wouldn't have told her unless she knew that Eleanor wouldn't betray her trust.
Or maybe she was hoping that Eleanor would, and when she didn't, you know, maybe she wanted the world to know, and she didn't realize Eleanor wasn't going to tell the world.
Well, I would say that Lucy didn't let go of what she thought she had until she had something else. And that one of her coping mechanisms was to inflict pain on people. And that flaw in her personality was fed by her ability to string Eleanor along by saying, you know, this is between us. And so Eleanor was, I think she could read people well, and she knew who she could, I'm going to say pick on in that respect, but I think that was her coping mechanism for getting through the challenges that she faced in her world. It's not that would be how Eleanor would choose to pursue if she were in the same situation. So I think her character flaw led her to act in that way because of the character that she was. Anyway,
You're too nice to call it a character flaw.
And on the one
I
hand,
associate more with Eleanor as a result, I guess. So
on the one hand, if apart from how she deals with Eleanor and Edward, I love watching Lucy Steele manipulate people. I love how, you know, I love that she winds up being Mrs. Fair, one of Mrs. Fair's favorite daughters, along with Fanny.
They
And
belong together.
they
It's like
do.
that they got their just desserts.
yeah, I love that because of, you know, finding out about Lucy and Edward, Fanny, you know, went into hysterics all day, which she richly deserved. I have no problem with Lucy manipulating Mrs. Ferrers, Fanny, Robert. I just have a problem with her being manipulating Edward and being so mean to Eleanor. But again, I don't like her, but I enjoy watching her in action.
That's like Mrs. Elton. Every time she's in a scene in Emma, I love the scene. But I would hate her as a neighbor.
And Mrs. Elton is so great because she's like an exaggerated version of Emma's own faults, and she drives Emma crazy, and Emma kind of needs to see that, I think.
Yeah, because Emma wants to be first. Emma wants, to everybody to follow her example and so forth. And she gets so angry when Mrs. Elton says, "Oh, well, why don't you and your father try Bath, and I can introduce you to people," and and of course Emma is much more refined than Mrs. Elton, but they are so similar.
Well,
Yeah, and that's like,
yeah, we see Emma's like inner thoughts, like she's on the surface, she'll be polite and sort of say what she's supposed to Mrs. Elton. And then we see her inner thoughts where she's like furious. She's internally screaming.
I
And
wonder if Emma would have disliked Mrs. Elton so much if she hadn't wanted Harriet to marry Mr. Elton. I always wonder if Emma is just sort of even though she thinks she's not predisposed to hate Mrs. Elton, I think she is. I mean, Mrs. Elton is very annoying, but most of the other characters manage to deal with her without, becoming furious.
Well, that's because we don't see their internal process. So
I think you're right. That is part of it, is that. Yeah, is this comparison in her mind, or this knowing that like her friend Harriet, who she's defending and thinks so highly of, is being slighted by that Mr. Elton is so snobbish towards her, and then yet this is the person he picks. So I feel like, and then it reaches the point where the Eltons like they realize they both know like what had happened before with her and Harriet and Mr. Elton, that definitely lays the foundation for them to be on rocky footing.
And wouldn't you say that some people need to have control over something? Like Mrs. Elton could have control over Jane Fairfax by trying to insist that, oh, you need to be a governess. Oh, I've got these contacts. And then she insisted on pursuing those contacts. And then wouldn't you say that Lucy felt she had control over Eleanor because she knew just she could read between the lines from what she heard from Edward Ferrars, that Eleanor was in higher esteem in his mind than what Edward probably thought he was relating, but Lucy could pick up on that because that was her coping mechanism to understand where her competition was, and for her to have control over any given situation, she needed to know if someone was stronger or if they were weaker than her control over them. Anyway, those are just some thoughts along those lines that I would offer.
Yeah, and especially with Mrs. Elton, it's like a parallel to Emma's own, like having that control over Harriet, is that Mrs. Elton is trying to do that to Jane Fairfax, and she can see the ridiculousness of it in that case, or even that Mrs. Elton almost goes so far as to try to be the patroness of Emma herself, which is the thing that most offends her. But she being able to see how arrogant that is, to be like, make yourself the benefactress and like I can control and guide you to other young women, is like really important for her to learn.
It always bothers me that Mrs. Elton is trying to get a governessship for Jane Fairfax instead of trying to find her a husband. It's like Mrs. Elton knows that Jane Fairfax is superior. She's a better singer and player. She's more refined. I think she wants her out of Highbury, and that's just I could forgive Mrs. Elton a bit if she were trying to, really help Jane. But as we all know, being a governess was not desirable.
yeah, it also gets her like prestige at Maple Grove if she finds someone a governess. So like double prestige. She has Highbury prestige and Maple Grove prestige. But I like that point about why wasn't she trying to find a rich husband?
And then that would give Mrs. Elton the same opportunity to brag, like we remember hearing Lady Catherine de Bourgh brag about making a good position
Miss Pope.
for someone. I can't remember the names, but you
Miss
remember that
Pope.
conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, that also, I guess, the governess position is her way of asserting superiority also. Like if she were trying to find a husband for her, that would be saying that they were equals. And if she's finding a governess position, she gets to feel superior.
Because the role of governess was not a high role, it was a low role. Even though it wasn't a servant, it wasn't, she still didn't eat with the governess didn't eat with the family in the dining room.
Yeah.
I found out, probably you all already know this, but I found out a few months ago some background material about, well, that when they talk about her father as being a Bristol merchant, he must be called, that was a euphemism for a slave trafficker. Somebody who sold and bought, enslaved Africans, and that Hawkins, because her maiden name is Hawkins, and I think the first British person who started engaging in the slave trade in the 17th century was a man named Hawkins, and he was in Bristol, and apparently Bristol, where Mrs. Elton is from, was very, there was a lot of slave trading going on in Bristol. So that, and then her wanting Jane to become a governess, and Jane making an analogy between the governess trade and the slave trade, I think is very significant.
Yeah, the Harvard edition of the different volumes, and the Harvard edition of Emma is edited by I'm not sure how you say his first name, but Bharat Tanda. And it's very good. It has lots of like historical context if anybody's looking for, a really good set of annotated editions. It's the Harvard Belknap Press. They have, they're huge books. They have beautiful illustrations. But yeah, that they discuss in there how Bristol, just the city name Bristol, has all these associations with slavery, and even if the person wasn't actually a slave trader, that person might have been like supplying the ships or somehow making his living off of that.
Another thought I had about Emma, as I'm actually just rereading it right now, is that if it weren't for Mr. Knightley, I feel like Emma could very easily have become a Lady Catherine de Bourgh if she the general direction she sort of headed in life. And I'd be curious to see like an alternate version of Emma, what she would have been like as she got older.
Yeah, it's like Jane Austen's version of a good marriage is where your spouse makes you a better person. And he definitely makes her a better person. I think she makes him a better person. I think she brings joy and life and, like exuberance to his poor existence of reading over the books at night, his farming books at Donwell Abbey.
I think Mr. Knightley looked at Emma as his project, and if she became a better person, which she was on that path to becoming so, then he would feel like he had succeeded, since all the advice he had given her throughout her life would have inspired her to become a better person, since he was always giving her advice.
But he realized that that was actually the wrong way to do it, because that, like, especially in someone who's much younger, would sort of provoke resistance.
There's
So
a point
Emma's,
he says that, yeah.
Emma's character was also somewhat guided by her governess. She had a loving, caring governess, so that would factor in her, attitude and character, whether Mr. Knightley was in her life or not.
And thank goodness Mrs. Weston didn't live that far away. So she still exercised an influence that could be ongoing, a good
Yeah.
influence.
I think maybe Emma helped Mr. Knightley too. I mean, she brought joy into his life, but he's such a blunt person. He's very good-hearted, but he could be that chapter in the beginning when he basically tells Mrs. Weston, yes, well, you were a terrible governess, and it's better, that you're a wife, when in fact, I think she was an excellent governess. Emma may not practice piano as much as she should, but she's still fairly accomplished. And he even can be abrupt with Miss Bates. And I think, when he wasn't sure about whether Emma loved Frank Churchill and all that, and when he finally proposes to her, he's very humble about it. And I think that he talks in the beginning about how he'd like to see Emma in love and in some doubt of a return, and it would do her good. But he's the one throughout so much of
Famous
the
last
novel.
words.
Yeah, and it's like good. I mean, he's a fine man. But well, I'm married to somebody who's more like Henry Tilney, so I'll just leave it at that.
We haven't talked much about Pride and Prejudice, and any thoughts about like Caroline Bingley, if she belongs on the list, or she's not a very good manipulator, but she tries to manipulate Darcy.
And her brother.
Yeah, she's overbearing with her brother, and
Mhm.
and to some success. But yeah, I think it's just hilarious how every attempt she makes with Darcy is just like falls flat. Does she ever feel like a threat to Elizabeth, to anybody when you're reading it? Do you feel like?
I think she's a threat because she hurts Jane. That's what gets us, that because Jane is so trusting and open, and that's what indirectly hurts Elizabeth, because she cares so much about her sister, and she does not want to see her taken in and hurt by Caroline.
I would sometimes wonder if Mr. Darcy is playing with her mind a bit. When when the first time he tells her about the fine olive, gazing with fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman, and he knows she's gonna think it's her, and then and she says so many things, and he sees right through her. I wonder if he's having fun doing that, because he knows she wants to marry him.
Well, he's more blunt with her, I suppose, than somebody else who's similar to Caroline Bingley that he's not associated with. Obviously, I think he feels a bit of freedom in the way he addresses her.
No.
But I think we can deduce that he's kind of dealt with the care of Bingleys for most of his young life, and he's a bit tired of it now.
No.
And Bingley came into his life, I think that what they say, about 3 years into the Pride and Prejudice book, something like that. So even prior to that, Mr. Darcy had to deal with other brothers, sisters.
I think he was putting up with her because he wanted Bingley to marry his own sister. He wanted Bingley to marry Georgiana.
What?
Oh,
Jesus.
yeah. Yeah.
He was in favor of that, yeah.
He wanted
Yeah.
Darcy wanted Bingley to marry Georgiana. That's why, he made sure that everything was so hush hush about her almost eloping with Wickham. And of course, Carolyn and Louisa wanted their brother to marry Miss Darcy. I mean, it would have been a huge, social climb for them. And so I think Darcy's putting up with Carolyn and Louisa and Mr. Hurst when he's awake, so that he can get Bingley to marry Georgiana.
I assume that he was putting up with him because he was Bingley's friend. When Bingley came into that society, he guided Bingley. And I felt that it was his responsibility to maintain that friendship. And in order to maintain that friendship, he had to be somewhat friendly to Bingley's sisters. I've read Pride and Prejudice more than any other Jane Austen's book, some 25 times now. I have never picked up on Darcy wanting Bingley and Georgiana to marry. I guess I have to read it again. I'm currently reading a adaptation right now, but
it's in the third it's in the third
It's
volume.
speculation, though,
I
that
think the
Lucy-
sisters wanted him to.
No,
well,
because
sisters do,
sisters.
sure.
you
The
and I-
sisters do, yes.
I
Lucy was
recently reread
speculating
it because
that.
I'm going to be teaching it this semester.
Yeah.
And so we know that his sisters want him to
Mhm.
in volume 1 and 2, but in volume 3, when Elizabeth is visiting and the Gardners are visiting at Pemberley, Austen, the narrator does say that Darcy wanted Georgiana to marry Bingley.
But the narration is kind of free and direct discourse. So my interpretation of that was that it was Lizzie's perspective, that she was speculating that about Darcy's intentions, but it was a little bit unclear as to whether that is actually his intention.
I
I-
interpret it like Miriam, that he actually, I mean, he was willing to give up that desire. And I think that the notion, like Bingley's a nice person and would be a good husband. I mean, I think part of that is like, he's, probably felt incredibly protective, and after Wickham, there's such, risk of his daughter, of Georgiana marrying anyone, she's so trusting. And so it's like, he probably feels like, I have to make sure that she marries a nice guy who's not gonna abuse her or take advantage of her.
But if Elizabeth Bennet was below him and came from the gentry, wouldn't Charles be even lower than that, since he came from trade, even though he's rich?
But I think for Darcy, if he would treat his sister well, that would be more important to him than whether their origins were in trade.
I got the feeling that he didn't want his sister to ever marry.
Yeah, I had more sense that he was protecting his sister. I've
Mhm.
never had a sense of what you were describing. That's a new thought to contemplate.
We'll
she's
look
just
for the
young.
passage and send it out when I send out the link for the video.
I'm sure he's thinking ahead, but she's still 16 at this point, and I don't think he's ready for her to. I mean, she's not ready to marry yet anyway. So, to have Charles wait at least 2 more years, I don't know.
And there's no reference in the book that I remember where Bingley's interested in Georgiana
Oh, he's not.
whatsoever.
He's not. He's
It's
not at
just his
all.
sisters imply that
Yeah,
in the letter to Jane. So
Yeah.
that's where we get that idea. But
the
we-
manipulative sisters.
Mhm.
But then again, in the third volume, when Elizabeth's at Pemberley with the Gardners, and I know that passage can be you have to disentangle the syntax, but it really is the Arthurial, the narrative confirming what Elizabeth had suspected, that Darcy did want Bingley to marry Georgiana.
I do find that as I read Jane Austen's novels, I spend more time writing things down on a pad, a paragraph, ask myself, okay, what is she trying to say here? I've got pages and pages. Well, I find that I'm not reading the novel anymore. I'm just like I'm in class somewhere and taking notes. So
You know an author's great when you've read it 25 times and you still find something new on your
Absolutely.
26th reading.
And I would ask, does any other author cause you to want to do that? I mean, that just sort of is the greatest example of why we love Jane, that we're willing to continue after 25 readings or even more to continue drilling in, trying to figure out stuff.
Well, Shakespeare and Chaucer for me. But yes, there are very few, there are very few writers you can go back to and still find so many new
A
things.
lot of intrigues, a lot of twicks or tweets, I guess you could call them. Twicks more so in her novels that it's like, what?
Well, it's funny because for all Lady Susan is so cold, I think she really does love Alicia.
Frederica?
No, I don't think she
Oh,
loves
her friend Alicia?
her friend Alicia. Yeah, no, I don't think she loves her daughter.
Okay.
Frederica, but I
I
do,
was like, no, I don't think so.
no, I do think she really does love Alicia though.
I think with her, it seems like if she feels like someone loves her unconditionally, which she felt like Mannering did, if I'm saying his last name right, that's what her, so I think like she felt like Alicia, she accepts me no matter what, she gets me. So yeah, I think she did have fondness for her and wish that her husband were dead and she were free. Which is one of the funniest letters when he's too young to die, too old to be governable.
Well, and she,
Yeah, I was just gonna bring up Lady Susan. We haven't talked about her too much yet. I feel like she's sort of the I don't know what the word is, but like the first, not the beta edition. What's the first edition of this sort of mercenary and manipulative, overbearing person? And maybe the most supreme creation. Oh, sorry, what, Sarah?
Like maybe the prototype, but that's not quite the word.
Thank you. That was actually the word I was looking for. Who loves, like, I love reading Lady Susan. I love the novel and letters. I love the play between Lady Susan and Catherine Vernon. And I wonder, like, why are the men all so like clueless? Clueless.
Well, if I may interject, and this is Delicia, which I'm sure is listening to all of this, but with her being representative of Jane Austen summer program, I participated as I was a participant in that program. One of our and I know North Carolina is on the other side of the country for you guys. I'm in South Carolina, so I just had a 4-hour drive, and this was my second year to attend in person. It's just so much fun. UNC Chapel Hill and Ingerberde and all those folks just do an incredible job with bringing to life whatever the theme is for each of the years, and they've been doing it for well over 10 years now. So this year it was focused on her teenage writings, and the interesting thing, and I'll throw this aspect regarding Lady Susan into the fray here, and that is juvenilia or teenage writings goes up to age 18. Which was, I wasn't aware of that. There's a whole world in academia focused on writers' juvenilia. Awesome. This program actually overlapped with the Society of Academics who focus on juvenilia. I'm forgetting the precise title of their, but their conference was going on and we overlapped. And so we got to participate or listen to some of their speakers. So that was neat to have that opportunity. But one of the highlights of the program is that the director of Love and Friendship, which he told us the reason why he called it Love and Friendship instead of Lady Susan, because, you know, I'm sure at least once all of us have said, what do you mean Love and Friendship? That's Lady Susan. He said the reason why he used that title is because he wanted it to correlate with Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice. So he liked that parallel with the ampersand, and he thought that title went that route better than Lady Susan did. So that was his reason for it. But the director's Stillman, and so I'm holding up this book cover because this was a book he wrote that explained his version of the movie. And you'll like the subtitle. It says Love and Friendship, in which Jane Austen's Lady Susan Vernon is entirely vindicated.
I've read that before. It's very funny. It's written by like her nephew or something, right?
Yes, yes.
Allegedly.
But anyway, it was just a delight for him. So we had a viewing of the movie. Prior to, he took questions, Q&A, and then after the viewing, we had more Q&A. So it was just a lovely treat to experience that. And I just wanted to throw that out because it was fun.
It's one of my favorite adaptations. I think like he perfectly captures the spirit of Jane Austen.
I mean, the language just, it just flows. I mean, I can't talk like they talk in the movie, but when you hear them say it, it just flows so naturally. You just fully believe you can start talking like that when you know you can't. And the way they translated letters into a script, that was fun. There were just a lot of wit involved. Just the whole, it makes you want to watch the movie again. I mean, thankfully I have the DVD myself, but it was just fun to see it on a big screen, which I'm used to seeing it on my, which feels like a big screen in my TV at home, but really it's little when you get to the movie theater. But anyway, it just, the whole, all of the attention to detail, the big hairdos, because we're not talking about really Regency at that time, and then there was something about the, and I wasn't into it, so I kind of lost the reference, which some of you may know, but it seems like I think it was her daughter who is who went on to was she in Game of Thrones or anyway
The woman who played Frederica.
Yes, big after this she became really big in one of the big blockbuster kind of, I think it was Game of Thrones, but I'm giving my preferences away. Some things that I haven't watched myself, so I kind of was lost on that reference, but it was just fun to see. They were enjoying seeing her in that role then, knowing that that's what she did later, became this bigger star. Anyway, so those were just some fun little details attached to that experience that I wanted to share. So.
Yeah, I think that sort of connects, like Lady Susan in general sort of connects with the question of like, why is it that the men in many of the novels have a harder time knowing when they're being lied to by a woman? And like, what's Jane Austen saying about, kind of if you're out of power, is it that, you know, you have to be better at lying and dissembling, and you can't be blunt and tell the truth like Mr. Knightley does?
I absolutely agree. I started out, still am a medievalist, though I do, you know, I've written on Austen and, you know, and later authors, but women for so long didn't have the same rights as men, and so they had to know men and the society they lived in better than those men knew themselves. At least the, you know, the women who were clever and wanted to, they basically they had, I think, a lot of indirect power behind the scenes if they were good, if they were good at what they did. And I think they, you know, that they, like you said, they had to learn it, or they were much better off if they did. And so the men, so many men didn't think that women were as intelligent as they were. And so, you know, and so, yeah, I think some men were pretty easy to fool.
And women were told at the time, if you're smart, don't let the man know that, because not so good for marriage.
Yes, if a woman in Northanger Abbey, if a woman has the misfortune of knowing anything, she should conceal it as best she can.
Yeah, it's rare that a woman didn't care about that. That's why I liked Elizabeth Bennet. She didn't care. She was always blunt, and she didn't care whether, you know, men thought she was superior to them or not. And she was, and is.
If you're a truly good hero, you want a smart woman because they challenge you.
Yeah, that's
Mhm.
what Knightley says too.
How about, we haven't talked much about persuasion, and I think you know, sort of the main person with that is Elizabeth Elliot, as kind of the most awful sister you could have in the world. But then, you know, there's sort of the question with Lady Russell, you know, like, so she thought she was being helpful to Anne, and Anne still loved her. But, you know, do people see her as just as bad as Lady Catherine, or do people see her as, you know, flawed and maybe not having super good judgment? But I think that's, you know, kind of an interesting question for persuasion.
Well, I think for as far as Lady Russell goes, there's an expression that I use a lot myself that seems applicable here, and it's life happens and time passes. I think that at the time she gave Anne that advice,
Motherly.
and acted on it. It made sense at the time, but then 8 years later, it's, oh my God, my dear goddaughter here is still not married, and she's still unhappy, and it's sort of like Anne's having to still console her and say, no, I don't blame you, I don't blame myself. You know, who knew that that Captain Wentworth was going to go off and make his fortune? You know, we just didn't know, you know. So anyway, I would throw that out. But having just watched 1995 and 2007 just in the last couple of days.
Very
I
wise
agree.
not to watch the 2022 one.
No, I've seen it once. That's all I needed.
Yes, I saw it, and then I immediately turned on the 1995.
Yeah,
I have
it's
chosen not to see it.
My eyes are burning. I need a reparative emotional movie experience.
We need a good adaptation. But yeah, I agree that Lady Russell, I think, is extremely well intentioned, but she is somewhat prejudiced, and we know that she kind of has this kind of like class and rank prejudice. Although it doesn't like fully guide her, she has like some good discernment as well. And I think she doesn't realize that her prejudice is part of what is guiding her in that. in that advice. But I think she is very well intentioned and is mostly, even though she was wrong.
Well, she took over the role of mother, once Anne's mother died. She felt that was her responsibility. The families know each other for eons.
I actually would argue that Captain Wentworth needed to mature before he could deserve Anne.
Mm.
I don't think he fully appreciated how wonderful she was. Like, they had that passionate love, but I don't think like he fully kind of knew just how amazing she was.
And maybe it drove him to excel because he had to prove himself to everybody. I am better than what they think I might have, might not be. He might have been just a kick around guy and not really have pushed himself to be a better person.
I think Lady Russell, she loves Anne, she appreciates Anne, but I don't think she understands her as well as she thinks she does. Anne is much Anne's feelings, her intellect are so very delicate and elegant, and her feelings are, her feelings are very, very tender. And I really don't think Lady Russell realized that. I mean, at one point she would have been happy for Anne to marry Charles, but Anne wouldn't have been happy with Charles. And I agree, Wentworth needed to appreciate her more than he did, but he did appreciate her. And he was really the only one besides Lady Russell who did.
Well, it would also, I would, what comes to mind, if I can make myself a little more articulate than I was in the last couple of minutes, but it just seems like, going back to Pride and Prejudice, it seems like Mr. Darcy needed to have the comeuppance of being refused in the first marriage proposal in order for the second marriage proposal to end up happening. So I as you were saying that, I could just see a little parallel with maybe, as you're saying, Captain Wentworth needed for the first refusal, or the first, I guess it was a refusal to happen, so that he could succeed in spite of it in order for the second one to happen. I think there's some parallels there, for sure.
I don't think Lady Russell would have been happy if Anne married Charles Musgrove. I believe that there is a scene, it's been a while since I read it. There's a scene where one of Charles's sisters is telling Wentworth that they believe that it was Lady Russell who talked Anne out of marrying Charles. So
They say that, but they're wrong, because the book tells earlier that Lady Russell actually would have.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
But that they still, which is telling about people's perception of her as a person and her power over Anne, is that they assume because she said no, it must be under Lady Russell's approval that she, or
So Rosemary had a good comment about having what, is Mary Musgrove one of the manipulative, mercenary, or overbearing people, or is she, like a villain, or is she just a fun whiner? She's another one, like every time she shows up, it's like, oh yay, it's Mary.
I would say she's a piece of work. That's the best, the kindest thing I can say.
And her sore throats, are always worse than anyone else's sore throats.
That's what I was going to say, that Mary reminds me, I've met people that are very like her in these modern times,
Well, that's the genius of Jane Austen. I think we can all think of somebody who, at least reminds us a little bit of one of her characters.
All of her characters.
It's interesting. I mentioned that I had seen the 1995 and the 2007 adaptations of Persuasion just in recent days. I will say that I've kind of been watching a lot of them lately because I just came back from the Jazzna Summer Tour. My first experience in to walk in Jane's shoes, and oh my God, let me tell you, if you haven't done it and you ever have the opportunity, I had to wait till I was 66 to be able to make it happen for me. But oh my gosh, it was just an incredible experience. And I'm still unpacking everything that I'm feeling inside. It's just sort of like overwhelming. And I've got all my pictures and I've got the books and I've got that movie. So I just keep doing stuff to kind of translate what I feel and what I'm seeing and what I'm experiencing. And so one of the things is, just trying to interpret, going to Lyme Regis, anyway, just so all to say, what prompted me to start that comment was that having seen the two adaptations of Persuasion was to try to put it in perspective with what I saw in Bath and what I saw at Lyme Regis. And what I noticed as well was that Charles Musgrove was a little bit more sympathetic in the 2007. The 1995, you just felt like he was kind of more of a buffoon, the way they portrayed him. Sort of like, well, how could you even consider him to be someone for Anne? And in the 2007, he was just a very, he was attentive to Anne. He still showed her respect, and you could believe that but he still had respect for Mary, his comical wife, whereas there was no respect shown in the 1995 version between Charles Musgrove and Mary. So it was just kind of interesting how they played those relationships in both those adaptations. Anyway, thank you for letting me ramble on about that for a moment. So.
And I think in the 2022 Persuasion, the Charles Musgrove character was actually like, oh, he's a charming man. and like, yeah, he seemed like the most, one of the more interesting characters. Like there should have been more of him in the movie.
And all we can think of is here we are waiting for Anne and Captain Wentworth to, have their moment. And here's Charles Musgrove going on about that damn rifle in the shop. You go away, get.
Well, we've got just a few minutes left, so just want to see if anybody has any last minute thoughts, or anyone that had like a burning question they wanted to discuss that we didn't get a chance to get to. Seemed like we covered lots of territory, but anything that we didn't talk about that people want to touch on?
I thought, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. You go ahead, Sarah.
Okay, I was just going to say, I thought the question in the discussion question on coldness and what that means to Jane was kind of interesting, and we haven't really touched on that.
Well, thank you, since you liked the question. Yeah, and I think it sort of connects with Miriam's initial question about Mary, because Mary is warm, and usually with warm characters, Jane Austen will forgive a lot, but she forgives nothing with cold characters. Yeah, so like what's that about, do you think? Like why is coldness so repulsive?
Kind of a closing off, or like lack of empathy, sympathy for other people. It's often connected with kind of pride and calculation and other things, but I don't know.
Conversation was part of how people entertained themselves, and people who were described as cold were bad conversationalists. So I think that would be significant, even with Jane Austen, you know, around her family and friends. And there's a couple letters to Cassandra where she doesn't use the term cold, but she talks about a couple of people at a ball that were just, you know, not conversing with anybody and standing aloof off in a corner. So
Yeah, like there's this social obligation to be social,
yes.
and cold people like don't play the game.
She was also such a sincere Christian. And I don't, you know, think that, you know, that she could conceive of anybody being a sincere Christian who was cold. You know, you have to have that warmth. You know, if you think of the whole, and I'm not Christian myself, but I'm a medievalist, so I'm an honorary one. You've got the, you know, Christ's act of redemption was as warm as anything possibly could be. And if you were Christian, you were supposed to live in imitatio Christi. You were supposed to live a Christ-like life. And a cold, you know, somebody cold, just they didn't have that love. They couldn't do it.
That's really interesting to think about it as sort of being connected with her faith, and sort of like that the social obligation, there's a piece of it that is, yeah, connected with faith. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that really is the foundation for everything that Jane cares about. So sometimes I struggle even to like define in my head like what coldness and warmth, what that means. But I feel like instinctively you kind of understand someone who's kind of like reaching out and caring about other people, caring about their feelings, and being like open to like feeling what other people are feeling, and being and like supporting them, or I don't know.
I would throw in a book recommendation. I have last year I was introduced to a book title, and then just yesterday, well, in over the course of the year, and then as recent as yesterday, heard the author speak about it. And I'm a very strong Christian myself. I'm an Episcopalian, but I'm very contemplative. And so that kind of makes me open to other religions, to add to my own. But what I was going to say too is that one of our folks, Catherine Duncan, who is who just put out a book called Jane Austen and the Buddha, she goes into great clarification, which I think goes with what we were just saying, that explains all of the aspects of Buddhism, and how that goes to explain a lot of what we were seeing. She applies it. She's a Methodist herself, but she just found a lot of comfort in Buddhism as it related to her work. Anyway, I just showed this book to you because it just gives lovely clarity and talks about warmth and versus coldness, and it just explains a lot of things, and it gives a structure to work with that makes great sense. And anyway, I'm about 3/4 through the book myself, but I've been very impressed with the way she's described it. And she herself focused a lot on persuasion during some hard times. She couldn't read for pleasure. She just kept reading and rereading books, and she kept rereading Persuasion, and that just sort of said a lot to her. But and she applies what she learned here with all the different books. But anyway, I mentioned this because it seemed applicable to what we were talking about. So again, Catherine Duncan is her name.
Right.
And Jane and Company at UNC Chapel Hill. They have the Jane Austen and Company program. She's one of their featured speakers in the Asia and the Regency program.
Oh,
So you could
there's
go
a
in
video.
if you wanted to just get a the with the, a short version of what I'm trying to describe, that video gives you a really nice, it synthesizes what she says very
Okay.
nice.
I'll look for the link for that and I'll add it to I'll send an email out when I get the video up of the discussion. And
Anyway, I
add
just
that.
thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought she did a lovely job with using those concepts and explaining a lot of what we were talking about, like coldness and lack of empathy or needing empathy.